Hello and welcome to Demystifying Poetry, the podcast that brings everyone closer to poets and poems. I am your host, Tara Stubbs, and this episode my guest is the poet Jacqueline Saphra. Hello Jacqueline, I'm so glad that you could join us today.
I'm very glad to be here too. Hello.
Jacqueline Saphra is a prize-winning poet, agitator, teacher and organiser. She is the author of 9 plays, 5 chapbooks and 5 poetry collections. Her second collection, All My Mad Mothers, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Her 5th, Velvel's Violin, a Poetry Book Society recommendation and Radio 4 Poetry Book of the Month, was out from 9 Arches Press in July 2023. She teaches for the Poetry School and is a founder member of Poets for the Planet. A personal aside, I first encountered Jacqueline and her work when I received a copy of her 100 lockdown sonnets in the post in 2021 during the pandemic, and we still haven't worked out who sent it. So I mentioned in your introduction that I was sent a copy of your 100 lockdown sonnets in the post, and then I started reading around you, as it were. And we eventually got in touch with each other, didn't we? But one of the things that always struck me from the start is you're interested in form, and you also wrote a pamphlet about the importance of form, I believe, didn't you? So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about form, but also in general about your approaches to writing poetry.
Well, in most practices of poetry, the trick is to find the way that the content and the form are going to work in synergy together. Mm-hmm. And I think it's much underestimated how important that is. So you can have the most wonderful content in the world on a page, but if it's not expressed in a way with white space between the lines or between the words that supports that content, the poem becomes much weaker. So it is useful to be able to get your head around lots of different poetry forms, so that when you start to craft your content, probably in later drafts of poems generally, you can find the ideal vessel for it. And in my case, my home vessel is definitely the sonnet. But the sonnet historically has gone through very, very many revolutions, and some poems that poets describe as sonnets you would not necessarily think were sonnets. Like, they might not be 14 lines, they might not have rhymes in them, they might not be metrically regular. So there's everything to play for. But in my opinion, it's like, if you think about Picasso did life drawing before he became a cubist, right? He understood how to do a line drawing, draw a figure. And it's the same with the sonnet. If you can just master the basics of the sonnet, the technical basics, then you can go off any way you want. So it's a very, very useful vessel for putting difficult material, the sonnet. Some people's home form might not be the sonnet. It might be the haiku, or it might be the pantun, which is a different form from a different place, Malaysian. So you can never tell when you start writing a poem how it's going to emerge or what you want to do with it. And sometimes a given form is great. Sometimes I think what we call organic verse or free verse is more appropriate.
Do you believe that any verse is truly free?
No, that's why I use the word organic, really.
Yes, because I've not heard of that term before. Yeah. That seems much better to me, organic verse.
I think it was Marge Piercy, who's an American poet, who came up with that as an expression. But as soon as you start to put a line on a page, you're making a form. Exactly. And some people might say it's more difficult to invent your own form than it is to use one that someone else has invented.
And I think as well, if you're using a form that others have already used, you're already in dialogue with other poems as well, in a clearer way, perhaps.
I think that is true. And I think, again, a lot of contemporary poets underestimate how much they have received from other poets historically, even if they don't recognise it. Yeah. And the more I do it, the more I feel I'm writing some kind of, homage to someone else, or there's something I've taken from someone else whose poetry I've read. It might be Keats, or it might be Edna St. Vincent Millay, who was a great sonneteer in the earlier part of the 20th century.
She's not read very much anymore.
No, she's not read very much because metric rhyming verse is not very popular. Modernism really put paid to her, as it did to many formal poets.
Well, we could have a whole other podcast probably about that. I was really interested that you said that the form comes later.
Yeah.
This is a classic thing as a literary critic. I wrote a whole book in which I claim that the form came first when it comes to sonnets. Or I guess that was my assumption, even if it wasn't necessarily my obvious claim. That's really interesting. You just think it just eventually moulds itself into that form, or?
I think it varies. Some people will set out to write a sonnet. They'll think I want to write about how much I love this person. A sonnet would be such a great way to do it. But I'm always a little bit suspicious. Just like writing the poem as a process of discovery, and if you don't have any surprise in the writing of the poem, it usually isn't a very good poem. Finding the form is a process of discovery. Having said that, when I wrote 100 lockdown sonnets, I knew every day that I was sitting down to write a sonnet. So it has its place as a sort of template. You know, it tells you how to shape your thoughts and feelings into something meaningful. But sometimes I write a poem and it's, 3 pages long. And then I think, oh, look, it's got a rhyming couplet at the end. And, most of this can go, but there's some interesting little rhymes going on through this. And maybe it's only 14 lines and not 100.
You're not precious at all with your work?
No.
It makes me think there's a very famous poem called Poetry by Marianne Moore that she cut down from 67 lines to 4 lines.
Yes.
And she talks about poetry as imaginary gardens with real toes in them.
Yes.
I love that way of thinking.
Poetry is imaginary gardens with real toes in them.
There's things more important beyond this fiddle, she says, which I love.
Yes.
But I think for Moore, it's a similar idea that the form comes eventually and that you have to let the poem do some of the work in a way.
I think always let the poem do the work.
Yeah, because the poem eventually reveals itself, I suppose.
Or it doesn't. Sometimes you just put it away in a drawer. And then 10 years later you get it out and you think, this is not meant to be a sonnet at all. This is a long book-length poem or something like that. You often can't tell.
And you've used sonnets, collections of sonnets elsewhere as well, haven't you? Such as your poems about Lee Miller.
Yeah, so there's a longer form of a sonnet sequence called a heroic crown, because it is quite a heroic thing to write, because it's 15 sonnets and each one begins with the last line of the previous one.
That's right. Yeah.
And then the final sonnet is made up of all the 15 previous repeated lines. So it's a bit of a technical feat.
It's amazing. When I first read it, I couldn't quite believe that you'd done that. I thought, gosh, that's incredible.
So I did that because I was doing a challenge, writing 40 poems, 40 sonnets for Lent. And when I agreed to do it, I really didn't realise that Lent was 40 days long. And so, because I'm Jewish, it didn't occur to me. And about halfway through, I went to an exhibition of Lee Miller's photographs at the Imperial War Museum. And I thought, if I write a sonnet about one of these photographs every day, that will give me content for 15 of the days of Lent. So that's how that came about.
It sounds like you're very good at kind of letting the process, sort of trusting the process, maybe. Have you always had that belief in it, or did you have to develop that as a poet? Did you start off as confident, perhaps, as you are now, that things will work out?
Oh, I'm not confident.
No? Am I misreading that?
No, I mean, it feels often like starting again every time I sit down to write a poem. But I guess I've kind of got to know my own process a bit. So, for example, one of the things that happens to me a lot is that I start drafting a poem and then I get an overwhelming sense of hopelessness and despair. And the chaos in which it arrives feels absolutely unmanageable. And, I go to bed at night feeling like I don't know how to do this anymore and it's all going to be awful and what's the point? And then I wake up the next morning and something tends to have shifted. So one of the things I've learned to recognise is my own process, which is that part of my own process is chaos, despair and hopelessness.
It sounds very French, doesn't it?
I know, I'm making it sound a bit grand. It's not really grand. It's a little cottage industry, it's you alone in your room for a relatively small audience on the whole. We
were talking to Brian Bilston for another podcast, and it struck me so interesting. He says that he works on his poems from 9 till 5 every day, like a job.
Right.
But that includes reading. Do you have a similar thing, or is it more organic, the way that you do it?
I think it is a bit more organic, but I do have this belief that you have to leave the door open for the muse to come in. So you have to be there. If you're not there, she will visit, but not as often.
I'm quite fascinated by the idea of boredom as well, because I think what younger generations sometimes lack is the ability to be bored.
Yeah.
I keep trying to encourage my son who's 6 to be bored, because I think sometimes that's when creativity comes, funnily enough.
Yeah.
Do you think that as well, that you have to have these, well, you said you have these moments of despair, but also maybe boredom is interesting in kind of discomfort perhaps, or...
I don't know about bored. I don't think I ever get bored unless I'm having to deal with something like finances.
Right.
And then I kind of switch off and I go somewhere else. But I was on the train on the way here and I just put my book away and I put my phone away and I just thought, I'm just going to look out of the window. You know, what is life if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare. I think there is a lot to be said for silence, quiet and not doing anything. And certainly modern life is not equipped to be like that.
I remember there was a whole episode of Sex and the City about that. About
whether
can you just sit on your own in a restaurant with no accessories
props,
and you can just enjoy it and be by yourself, and how it's kind of an art form, and it's not one that people do very much now. People, I mean, I feel myself doing it. I can remember not having a phone and it's fine. But now I'm always, I might as well check that, I might as well look that up.
Yeah.
And we don't have those moments of just quiet.
And poetry is a quiet art. I mean, not always, but a lot of the time. You're in solitude, you generally, when writing. It's also very slow. And this is the thing, is that I've just moved to Suffolk and we've got this huge garden. And I think I actually don't want to I haven't got time to spend half an hour or an hour a day in the garden, because it takes me 3 hours to consider a comma. It's like that. it's like very, very slow. And the empty patches are very important. They're very important in the process.
But that isn't boring, it's part of the fiddle. Yeah. Great. Could you say a little bit more about your agitations, please? Because I find that's a really fascinating part of your whole poetry space.
Well, I suppose it's like, what is poetry useful for?
Yeah.
How can we make it useful? I was brought up as with a very socially conscious family. A very my grandmother was a communist, and she was a very strong influence on me. She always gave me this notion that I had to be useful and I had to be conscious and aware of what was going on in the world around me. And I think that currently, with climate collapse, with war everywhere, with all these awful things that are going on around us, I feel like I can't just sit in my little room and write about my children.
From your ivory tower.
Yeah. That I have to kind of connect what I'm doing to the wider world. So I've been involved in various projects, but I guess I kind of started off agitating in about 2016, when the refugee crisis really started to hit the newspapers, and we had a big poetry benefit with a thing called a poemathon, which is like a sort of poetry relay that went on all day.
Wow.
And everyone got sponsored, reading for 8 minutes each. And we raised, I don't know, something like £30,000, which for an art form that's considered to be the Cinderella of art forms, I think was quite good. And since then, poemathons, we had one for Women's Aid, we did one for Ukraine, we did one for Poets for the Planet, and other people have taken this up and done it. And it's not just about raising money, it's about raising consciousness, and it's about connection and community.
Yeah.
And poetry, although it's a very solitary art, is also a very connective art. It's amazing how many poets I know.
And they know you as well.
Oh, that's nice.
No, and I think that's really interesting, because it is a way of communicating as well. So do you feel that there's not so much competition between poets? Have you found it to be a more positive space, or does it depend?
I think it depends. I think it was Auden who famously said, "Show me a poet and I'll show you a shit."
I was just about to quote Auden, but not that line.
Or something a lot I might paraphrase. But, I think there is quite, there are very slim pickings in the poetry world. There are not many prizes. Getting published is very difficult. Getting reviews is difficult. If you want fame, don't become a poet. You're never going to. Even someone said a famous poet is not the same as a famous anyone else.
Well, I guess when you think of famous poets, probably Seamus Heaney is the top, but he wasn't that famous.
No. So I think you have to do it because you love it. That's the only good reason, and that is the only thing that's going to keep you going. You know, trying to get anyone to appreciate you or to love you, it's just impossible. You'll never get enough of that. What keeps me going is that exactly that process of attempt, despair, achievement, that something solid has emerged from the process of writing. I actually enjoy the process as well, even the dark bits.
Do you see that as spiritual in any way, or is it not to do with that side of things?
I suppose it is, because at the heart of it, there's a mystery.
You must believe in the words, I guess, on some level. Yeah.
And there is a kind of magic, there's a kind of alchemy that happens. I often sort of, when people say, oh, poetry's therapy, I say, yeah, but not in the way that you think. It's not just expressing yourself. It's turning the kind of raw feeling into art. So it becomes transformational. And that's the therapeutic aspect for the poet. And then the other therapeutic aspect is when somebody else reads it and gets something out of it, which is what happened with the 100 Lockdown Sonnets.
Yes.
Because, I was producing one a day. They were quite rough. I rewrote them before they were published.
And you posted them, didn't you?
Yeah.
Was it on Twitter? No.
I posted them on Twitter and on Facebook. And people often found them very comforting because I think I was sort of tapping into a collective feeling, whatever it was. You know, there was one about very early on about how everyone was loving everyone else.
Yes, I remember
we
that
all felt that. But then, there were more political ones. I wrote a fairly vicious few about Boris Johnson.
I know, I like those ones.
And a couple of vicious ones about Donald Trump, and those were very therapeutic for me, partly because I was making an art out of them. And Dr. Birx, the woman who was watching while Donald Trump said we all needed to swallow bleach. I wrote one about her because I thought, Birx, think of all the words that rhyme with Birx. And then I just went for it. And so the whole sonnet is just a series of rhymes with Birx. And I felt very much better when I came out the other end of that.
So it's cathartic for you as well.
Yeah.
I remember that those poems were really brilliant at capturing the unknown. They really felt like they were written in the moment. Obviously they were, but that real fear that we had at the start when we didn't really know what was going to happen.
Yes.
And I do think sometimes poets are often quite frightened of writing in the moment and for the moment. I remember I talked to Bernard O'Donoghue about this years ago, and he said he doesn't really know why more people don't write about what's happening now.
Yes.
But he thought that there's a fear that then those poems won't be universal or they won't be long lasting, because actually what a poet wants is immortality or whatever.
Yeah.
But actually I think those kinds of poems that you're describing are much more powerful because they're writing with the same feelings that everybody else has, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think also there is a feeling that because poetry is a slow art, there's a feeling that a poem written fast has less value. But I don't think that's actually true, because I think that the reason I can write a sonnet quite fast is because I've written a lot of sonnets.
Yes, and read a lot, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, of course. And so I think that the speed, if you can do it well at speed, that's only because you've had a lot of experience, a lot of practice. It's like
I think
anything.
the Van Gogh analogy is a really good one.
Yeah.
Sorry, Picasso.
Picasso, yeah.
But also Van Gogh.
Yeah, both.
And when you see their museums, you can see exactly what you said, how they start with much more conventional forms.
Yes.
And move on. So you've obviously done a lot of public work. How do you think the public in general interacts with poetry? And what kind of attitudes have you come across when you discuss it or you read your poetry with communities?
Well, I think people are often frightened.
Yeah.
And what I love best is when people come up to me after a reading because someone's dragged them along. They haven't really wanted to come, and they say, I don't really like poetry, but I really enjoyed yours. For me, that is the ultimate accolade. And I'm a bit of a crusader. Like, I really do want to get people engaged with poetry because I think it's a very undervalued and necessary way of self-expression. Because it is so distilled, it can be an enormously powerful thing. I mean, I'm not the first to say poetry is a secular form of prayer, but I really do think it's true. People often get in touch with me and say, can you recommend a poem for a wedding? Can you recommend a poem for a funeral?
Yeah.
That's where people go.
That's when they reach for it.
Yeah. And I think if people could sort of fit it into their daily lives a bit more, it does provide some comfort or some empathy or some moment of connection or some a way of reaching a feeling that perhaps you can't quite get to on your own.
And that maybe you don't need words for sometimes, because it's the stuff that happens beyond the words. Okay.
Yes.
That reminds me of what I was going to say that Auden said, which was in memory of W.B. Yeats, when he says, poetry makes nothing happen.
Yes.
But people slightly misquote that, because he says it survives in the valley of its saying.
Yes.
Which I think is really important.
Yes.
It's almost like it doesn't by itself make anything happen, but its actual survival, it's being passed on in different mouths.
Yes.
Is
it's
really
a way
important.
Of happening, a
way
mouth,
of happening,
he says.
mouth, yeah.
And I think that's very true. I think, how can we just how dare people take one line from that poem and think that's the end of what he said? It wasn't at all.
No.
It was more or less saying the opposite.
And I think a lot of people now say, I only read non-fiction because I want to know about the world. And they don't realise that things like poetry can also teach you about the world.
Yes. And fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Could you say a little bit about your own relationship with poetry? I mean, you've mentioned it a little bit. Are you an avid reader of poetry, or is it a bit of a problem that you've made your favourite thing your job?
No, I do. I read a lot of poetry.
Oh, okay.
I teach a lot, so I need to read a lot of poetry. And one of the reasons I love teaching is because of the preparation I have to do for teaching and the way I have to think about themes or forms or poets, the way I have to really concentrate on it. But even if I wasn't teaching, I would still be reading. It's terribly important.
We were saying earlier in another podcast that it's very strange when people say they don't read poetry because they don't want it to kind of corrupt their poetry.
Yes.
Very disrespectful almost, isn't it, to the form?
Yes, and also you can really steal methods. You can steal constructions from other poets. So if you sit and read a poem and think, how is this working? How has this got me from here over to here? And by what route? And you might realise, for example, that it starts off in the present, then it goes back into the past, and then it comes back to the present again. This is a useful construction. Then when you're writing about, how you're feeling about your mother, you might think, I could start off in the past. I could go to So it's very educational as well as being enormously satisfying. And I've got a whole lot of people I write to at different times when I find a poem I love, who I send it to, if I don't put it on social media, which I very often do as well.
And I think the traditional canonical poets, sometimes have a bit of an issue with how much value we attribute to them. But I think what they all have in common is that they all say that poetry is a borrowing. There isn't a unique poetic voice, really. It's always inflected by other voices and other, other opinions, and because that's what makes it poetry, really.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't any literary genre going to be affected by what went before it?
Yeah.
And by its contemporaries as well.
Have you ever come back to a poem years later and then sort of done something completely different with it?
Yeah, I have. Yes. I think often that's what happens, is you're too close to it. Just put it in the drawer, leave it for 10 years to mature, and take it out again. And think, yes, of course, this isn't really about my mother. This is actually about a river, or, the moon, or,
I love that. I love that it's sort of sitting there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like an old apple or something that you've forgotten about. That's great. I love it. I just was about to start wrapping up. So I tend to ask the same final question of everyone, which is, for someone wanting to get into poetry, do you have a poem or a poet or a collection of poetry that you would recommend?
Well, I really love the commentator and poet Edward Hirsch, the American. And he... I have his book called A Poet's Glossary, which is always next to my desk, where he writes as a poet about all the different forms and terms in poetry. But recently I've been reading his book, 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, which is just sublime, because firstly he's picked many, many different poems from many cultures and many parts in history. So we're going right from Keats right up to the present moment. And some are translations and some are not. So it's universal in the sense that it's world poetry. But what he does, which is really magical, is that he talks about the life of the poet and how that informs the poem. And he also does a very relaxed analysis of how the poem achieves its effects.
Oh, that's lovely.
But he also draws together some of the poems. So he'll say, in the same way that this person is writing about ice, this other person is also writing about ice. And you've read that poem, 10 pages back. And he just kind of draws these links between people and how they share these common themes, or might even be writing homages to each other. So you can see how everything feeds into everything else. You can see a kind of lineage, even between different cultures and different languages. It's a really, really wonderful book, and it may break your heart, but in the best possible way.
And I guess it's a labour of love as well, then, it sounds like. Yeah. So that sounds wonderful. I'm going to look that up. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. That was a really fascinating conversation. If people want to find out more about you and your projects, where can they go?
Well, I have a website, jacquelinesaphra.com, or you can find me on Facebook or at my publisher, Nine Arches Press.
Thank you so much again, Jacqueline, and thank you to all of our listeners. See you next time on Demystifying Poetry.